My name is Daniel Ashford, and I've been teaching at Westfield Academy for 8 months now. When I took this job, I thought the biggest challenge would be connecting with students and meeting curriculum standards. But the real challenge? Staying alive. Westfield has rules. Strange, terrifying rules that sound insane until you break them. Rule 3. Don't answer when someone calls your name in empty hallways, because something will learn your voice, your memories, your identity, and try to replace you. Rule 2. Don't stay in the library after the lights dim 3 times, because it collects human stories like books, and it wants to trap yours forever. Rule 1. Never enter the staff lounge after midnight, because dead teachers hold eternal meetings in there, and they're always recruiting new members. I've broken all 3 rules. I've heard my own voice calling to me from darkness. I've seen books with my name describing my death. I've listened through a door as colleagues who died decades ago planned my recruitment, and somehow I'm still here, still teaching, still following the rules, because at Westfield Academy, breaking the rules doesn't just cost your job, it costs your soul. Rule 3. Don't answer. When someone calls your name in the hallway after hours, they warned me about the voices on my first day, but I didn't believe them. Old building, strange acoustics, that's what I told myself. But then it happened to me. I was cleaning my whiteboard after detention when I heard my name echoed down the empty corridor. The voice was mine. I was hearing myself call my own name from somewhere in the darkness of the school. Daniel, Daniel, come here. I need to show you something. My own voice, but wrong somehow. Hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I felt my legs moving toward the door before I could stop myself, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain. I wanted to see who, or what, could mimic my voice so perfectly. My hand reached for the light switch to illuminate the hallway when suddenly the voice changed. It started laughing, my laugh, but I wasn't laughing. I pulled my hand back from the switch like it was on fire. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood frozen in the doorway of my classroom. The laughter continued, echoing down the hallway, bouncing off lockers and walls until it surrounded me from every direction. It was my laugh, but distorted, layered, as if multiple versions of me were laughing at once. The sound stopped abruptly. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. Then the voice came again, closer now, just beyond the doorframe. Daniel, why are you hiding? My own voice, but with an edge of amusement. I know you're curious. I know you want to see. I did want to see. God help me, I wanted to know what was out there. But something deeper, some primal instinct, kept me rooted to the spot. I remembered the janitor's words from my first day at Westfield Academy. His name was Marcus, and he'd cornered me in the supply room during lunch. He was an older man, weathered and tired-looking, with gray stubble and eyes that had seen too much. "You seem like a good kid," he'd said, not looking at me directly. "So I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but you'll remember it when it matters." I'd nodded, humoring him, thinking this was some kind of hazing ritual for new teachers. After hours, when you're alone in this building, you might hear voices. Could be anyone. Students, other teachers, people you know, people you don't. Doesn't matter. If someone calls your name after the last bell, you don't answer. You don't respond. You don't even acknowledge you heard it. "Why?" I'd asked, smiling nervously. Marcus had finally looked at me then, and there was no humor in his expression. "Because if you answer, it knows you're listening. And once it knows you're listening, it won't stop. It'll learn everything about you, your voice, your memories, your fears. And eventually, it won't just call your name anymore." He'd paused, his jaw tight. "It'll become you." I'd laughed it off at the time. Old school, old superstitions. Every building had its ghost stories. But now, standing in my darkened classroom with my own voice calling to me from the hallway, Marcus's warning felt less like a superstition and more like a survival guide. Daniel. The voice was right outside my door now. I could see a shadow moving in the frosted glass window, a silhouette that looked human-shaped, but somehow wrong in its proportions. I just want to talk. Don't you want to talk to yourself? I backed away from the door slowly, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. The shadow shifted, and I heard the doorknob rattle. My classroom door wasn't locked. I never locked it. Why would I? I was supposed to be alone in the building. The knob turned slowly, deliberately. The door creaked open an inch, then two. Through the gap, I could see the hallway beyond. Dark, empty, lit only by the emergency exit signs casting everything in a sickly red glow. There you are, my voice whispered from the darkness. I can see you, Daniel. But there was no one there. No figure in the doorway, no person attached to that voice. Just empty space and shadows. I grabbed my messenger bag from my desk, my hands shaking. I needed to get out, but the only exit was through that door, through that hallway. My windows were sealed shut. The school had installed them that way after a suicide attempt years ago. Where are you going? The voice sounded amused. We have so much to discuss. Like why you took this job, why you left your old school, why you left Sarah. My blood ran cold. Sarah was my ex-fiancée. We'd broken up 6 months ago, and I'd taken this teaching position to get away from those memories. No one at Westfield knew about her. I hadn't told anyone. How do you know that name? I whispered before I could stop myself. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a mistake. Marcus had said, don't acknowledge it, don't respond, and I'd just spoken directly to it. The laughter returned, but this time it wasn't just my laugh. It was layered with others. Sarah's laugh, my mother's laugh, the laugh of my childhood best friend who'd died in middle school. A chorus of familiar voices, all laughing at me. Oh, Daniel, my voice said, dripping with satisfaction. Thank you. Thank you for answering. The door slammed open, banging against the wall with a crack that made me jump. The hallway beyond was still empty, but I could feel something there, invisible but present, like a pressure in the air. Now we can really talk, the voice continued, and I watched in horror as the shadow on the wall began to take shape. My shape. It was me, or a version of me, cast in shadow despite there being no light source to create it. The shadow me stepped into the doorway, two-dimensional but somehow solid, and tilted its head in a gesture I recognized because I'd done it 1,000 times. What are you? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm you, it said simply, or I will be eventually. Every teacher who's answered has let me in a little more. I've learned from each of you, your voices, your mannerisms, your memories. But you're special, Daniel. You answered so quickly, so willingly. I thought about running, but where would I go? The shadow blocked the only exit. My mind raced through options, trying to remember if there was anything else Marcus had told me, any other warnings I'd dismissed. The others tried to run too, the shadow me said, as if reading my thoughts. Mr. Peterson lasted 3 days before he couldn't take it anymore. Ms. Chen made it almost a week, but they all answered just like you. And once you answer, I'm with you, in your head, learning, waiting. Waiting for what? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. The shadow smiled. I could see it in the distortion of its form. Waiting until I know you well enough to replace you. It usually takes a few weeks, maybe less for you. You're already so haunted, Daniel, so full of regret and guilt. It makes you weak, easy to slip into. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles white. I won't let you. You already have, it whispered. The moment you answered, you invited me in. Now I'm part of you. Every night when you go home, I'll be there. Every time you hear your name, you'll wonder, is it real or is it me? You'll start to doubt everything. Your memories, your thoughts, your very sense of self. And when you're confused enough, when you can't tell what's real anymore, I'll take over completely. Get out, I said, my voice shaking. Get out of my classroom. The shadow laughed again. My laugh, but colder. This isn't your classroom, Daniel. This is my school. It's always been my school. Teachers come and go, but I remain. I've been here since the building was constructed on the site of the old sanatorium. Do you know what they did to patients here? They tried to cure them by isolating them, by removing their sense of identity. And when those patients died, confused and alone, something remained. Something that learned how to take the identities of others. The emergency lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the shadow moved. When the lights came back, it was closer, halfway across the classroom now, its form more detailed. I could see the wrinkles in the shirt it wore. My shirt, the exact one I had on. I particularly enjoyed teachers. It continued conversationally, as if we were discussing lesson plans. You're already good at pretending, at putting on a performance for your students. It makes the transition smoother. And your students, they never notice. They're too self-absorbed to realize their teacher has been replaced. As long as someone shows up and teaches the curriculum, no one asks questions. That's not true, I said, backing toward the windows even though I knew they wouldn't open. Someone would notice. My family, my friends. What family? The shadow interrupted. Your parents are dead. You have one sister you haven't spoken to in 3 years. Sarah left you because you were emotionally distant. Isn't that what she said? That she felt like she was living with a stranger? Each word was a knife, cutting through the defenses I'd built around those painful truths. The shadow knew everything because I knew everything. It was pulling from my own memories, my own fears. Stop, I whispered. You're already alone, Daniel. That's why this job appealed to you. A fresh start, a place where no one knows your history. But you can't run from yourself, and now you can't run from me. The shadow was directly in front of me now, and I could see its face clearly, my face, but empty. The eyes were hollow, the expression blank. It reached out a hand and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the window. It'll be over soon, it said softly. In a few weeks, you won't even remember who you were, and I'll live your life better than you ever did. I'll be the teacher you always wanted to be, patient, dedicated, unburdened by trauma and regret. No, I said, and something in me snapped. Anger flooded through me, burning away the fear. You're wrong. You think you can replace me because you know my memories. Memories aren't what makes someone real. You're just an echo, a recording. You don't understand what it means to actually feel these things. The shadow paused, its head tilting again. Interesting. That's denial. Peterson went through that stage too. It's not denial, I said, my voice growing stronger. You said you've been learning from teachers, taking their identities. But you're still here, still in this building, still calling out to people in the dark. If you could really become us, really replace us, you'd leave. You'd go out into the world. But you can't, can you? You're trapped here. The shadow's expression shifted. Anger, maybe, or something close to it. I'm not trapped. I choose to stay. Liar, I said. You need this building. You need the darkness and the isolation. That's why you only call out after hours when the school is empty. You're bound to this place, to whatever happened in that sanatorium. You can learn our voices and our memories, but you can't actually become human. The lights flickered again, more violently this time. When they stabilized, the shadow had retreated slightly, its form less distinct. You're trying to make yourself feel better, it hissed, all pretense of friendliness gone. But it doesn't matter, you answered. The connection is made. I'll follow you home tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night after. I'll be in your dreams. I'll whisper your doubts back to you, and eventually you'll break. Maybe, I admitted. But I know what you are now, and I know you need me to keep answering, to keep engaging with you. That's how you get stronger, isn't it? Every response, every acknowledgement feeds you. The shadow didn't respond, which told me I was right. So here's what's going to happen, I said, straightening up despite my pounding heart. I'm going to leave now, and I'm never going to answer you again. I'll hear your voice, my voice, calling to me, but I won't respond. I won't even acknowledge it. And without that, you'll starve. You can't ignore me forever, the shadow said, but there was uncertainty in its tone now. Eventually, you'll slip. You'll forget and answer. They always do. We'll see, I said. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the door. The shadow didn't move to stop me. I realized it couldn't. It could frighten, manipulate, impersonate, but it couldn't actually physically harm me. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if I didn't give it more power. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt the temperature drop. The shadow's voice followed me, echoing off the walls. Daniel, wait. We're not done talking. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the exit sign at the end of the corridor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to maintain a steady pace. Running would show fear, and fear was a response. Daniel! The voice was louder now, angry, coming from all directions at once. The lockers rattled. Lights exploded in showers of sparks as I passed beneath them. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long, the exit sign never getting closer. But I didn't answer. I didn't even flinch. And slowly, gradually, the hallway returned to normal. The exit sign grew closer. The voice faded to a whisper, then to nothing. I pushed through the exit door and stood in the parking lot, gasping in the cold night air. Behind me, the school loomed dark and silent. I could feel it watching me, waiting to see if I'd turn around, if I'd acknowledge what had just happened. I didn't. I got in my car and drove home. That night, lying in bed, I heard my name called from the darkness of my apartment. My own voice, pleading, angry, desperate. It was coming from the closet, from under the bed, from the hallway outside my door. I pulled the covers over my head and counted sheep until I fell asleep. The next morning, I went back to school. Marcus found me in the parking lot before first period. You heard it, didn't you? He asked quietly. I nodded. Did you answer? Once, I admitted. I didn't know. Marcus's expression darkened. Then it knows you now. It'll follow you for a while, trying to get you to answer again. Most teachers quit after the first encounter. Some have mental breakdowns. A few. He trailed off, shaking his head. A few what? A few stops being themselves, he said simply. They keep coming to work, keep teaching, but if you look closely, something's off. They're too perfect, too consistent. No bad days, no personality quirks. Just going through the motions. I thought about the shadow's words, about replacing me, about becoming me. How long? I asked. How long does it try before it gives up? Marcus shrugged. Depends. Some people it leaves alone after a few weeks. Others it never stops. But I'll tell you this, the more you feed it, the stronger it gets. Don't talk to it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't even think too hard about it. Eventually it'll get bored and move on to easier prey. Has it ever succeeded? I asked. Has it ever actually replaced someone? Marcus looked at the school building, his expression unreadable. What do you think? He walked away before I could ask what he meant. That was 3 months ago. The voice still calls to me sometimes, usually late at night when I'm alone. My own voice, sometimes other voices, Sarah's, my dead friends, even voices I don't recognize. But I never answer. I've learned to tune it out, to treat it like background noise. The hardest part isn't the voice itself. It's the doubt. Every time I speak, I wonder, is this me? Or is it the thing wearing my voice? Every thought, every decision, every emotion, I question whether it's genuinely mine or something it planted there. I see a therapist now. I don't tell her about the voice, of course. She'd have me committed. Instead, I talk about anxiety and stress and the general difficulties of teaching. She gives me coping strategies and breathing exercises, and they help in their own way. I've thought about quitting, finding a new job somewhere far from Westfield Academy, but I'm afraid that if I run, it'll follow. At least here, in this building, I know what I'm dealing with. Out there, in the real world, I might let my guard down. I might answer without thinking. So I stay. I teach my classes. I avoid being in the building after hours when possible. And when I hear my name called from the darkness, I stay silent. But sometimes late at night, I wonder if the shadow is right. Maybe it has already replaced me. Maybe I'm just going through the motions now, a hollow version of who I used to be. Maybe the real Daniel answered that voice 3 months ago and never came back. Maybe I'm the echo now, and I just don't know it yet. The thought keeps me awake more than the voice ever could. Rule 1. Never enter the staff lounge. After midnight, Marcus had warned me about the staff lounge, but I didn't understand until it was too late. After midnight, that room doesn't belong to the living anymore, he'd said, his voice deadly serious. It belongs to the teachers who never left. I'd laughed it off. Another Westfield superstition. But when I walked past the lounge at 12:15 a.m. and heard voices inside, familiar voices, speaking in tones I recognized from old yearbook videos, I should have kept walking. Instead, I stopped. I listened, and then I heard my own name spoken by a woman who'd been dead for 20 years. Daniel Ashford will join us soon, she said matter-of-factly, like she was discussing a faculty schedule. He's always here late. He fits the pattern. I pressed my ear against the door, and that's when someone on the other side pressed back. I could feel them, inches away through the wood. "We know you're listening, Daniel," a male voice whispered. "Why don't you come in?" It had been 5 months since the library incident. 5 months of following every rule Marcus gave me, of treating Westfield Academy like the dangerous place it was. I'd learned to recognize the signs, the temperature drops, the sounds that shouldn't be there, the moments when reality felt just slightly off. But I'd gotten careless, or maybe just exhausted. It was a Tuesday night in late February, and I'd stayed late to finish progress reports. The administration wanted them by Wednesday morning, and I'd procrastinated. My own fault. By the time I looked up from my computer, it was past midnight. The school felt different at this hour. During the day, even with all its strangeness, Westfield had life. The sound of voices, footsteps, doors opening and closing. But after midnight, it became something else. The silence was deeper, the shadows longer. The building itself seemed to breathe differently, like a sleeping beast that might wake at any moment. I'd packed up my things and was heading for the exit when I remembered. I'd left my travel mug in the staff lounge that morning. It was a good mug, expensive, a gift from my sister. I didn't want to lose it. The staff lounge was on the second floor, not far from my classroom. I hesitated, checking my phone. 12:13 a.m., just after midnight. Marcus's warning echoed in my head, but I pushed it aside. I'd be in and out in 30 seconds. Grab the mug, leave, lock the door behind me. Simple. The hallway was dark except for the emergency exit signs casting everything in red. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum, too loud in the silence. As I approached the staff lounge, I noticed something that made me slow down. Light was coming from under the door, not the harsh fluorescent light of the overhead fixtures, but something softer, warmer, like lamplight. And I could hear something too, a low murmur of voices, barely audible. I stopped a few feet from the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Someone else was in there, another teacher working late, probably. Or maybe the night janitor, though Marcus usually worked the east wing at this hour. The voices continued, rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded almost like a conversation, but I couldn't make out the words. I should have knocked. That would have been the normal thing to do. But something stopped me. I moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The voices became clearer. Multiple people, at least 4 or 5, speaking in low, casual tones. I recognized the cadence. It was the way teachers talked during planning periods. Relaxed, familiar, the shop talk of people who spent all day in classrooms. Then I heard a name that made my blood run cold. Daniel Ashford will join us soon. It was a woman's voice, matter of fact, like she was reading from a list. I knew that voice. I'd heard it before, in old orientation videos I'd found in the media center when I was researching the school's history. Mrs. Patricia Wilson. She taught English at Westfield from 1985 to 2003. I'd seen her in the videos. A stern woman with dark hair pulled back in a bun, glasses perched on her nose, speaking about curriculum development with the passion of someone who genuinely loved teaching. She died in 2003. Car accident on the way home from school. He's always here late, another voice added, male this time with a slight southern accent. He fits the pattern. Dedicated, a third voice said. This one also male but deeper. That's what makes them vulnerable, the ones who care too much. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and get out of the building. But I was frozen, my ear still pressed against the door. Listening to dead teachers disgust me like I was a candidate for a job opening. How long do you think before he opens the door? The woman, Mrs. Wilson, asked. Soon, the first male voice said. They always do eventually. Curiosity, or carelessness, or just exhaustion. It doesn't matter why. Once they hear us, once they listen, they always open the door. And then he joins us, like all the others. Another teacher who couldn't leave Westfield behind. Another soul who stayed too long and forgot how to go home. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I started to pull away from the door, moving as slowly and quietly as possible when I felt it. Pressure on the other side of the door, like someone was pressing back against the exact spot where my ear had been. I jerked away, stumbling backward, and that's when I heard it. Right next to my ear, as if someone's mouth was pressed against the wood, a whisper so close I could feel the breath. We know you're listening, Daniel. Why don't you come in? I turned and ran. Behind me I heard the doorknob rattle. The door creaked open. Footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps, entered the hallway. Daniel, Mrs. Wilson's voice called out, echoing off the walls. Don't be rude. We've prepared coffee. We've been waiting for you. I didn't look back. I ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my bag banging against my hip. The footsteps behind me were steady, unhurried. They didn't need to run. They knew I couldn't leave. I burst through the door to the first floor hallway and sprinted for the main exit. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear more voices now, a chorus of them, all calling my name in tones that ranged from friendly to urgent to threatening. Daniel, come back. We need you for the meeting. You're already late. Just 1 cup of coffee, Daniel, that's all we ask. I got the door open and threw myself outside into the February night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I kept running, a across the parking lot to my car. My fingers fumbled with the key fob, dropping it once before finally unlocking the door. I dove inside and locked the doors, sitting there in the dark, my breath fogging the windows, watching the school. The main door I'd just run through stood open, and in the doorway, silhouetted against the interior lights, stood a group of figures. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could see their shapes. Teachers in business casual attire, standing perfectly still, watching my car. One of them raised a hand, not waving, just acknowledging, like they were saying, "We see you, we know where you are, we'll be here when you come back." Because I would come back, I had to. I worked here. I started the car with shaking hands and pulled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I watched the figures in the doorway until they disappeared from view. I didn't go home. I couldn't. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town and sat in a booth until sunrise, drinking coffee and trying to process what had happened. At 6 a.m., I called Marcus. "You went to the staff lounge," he said immediately, not even waiting for me to explain. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Because you're calling me at 6 in the morning, and I can hear the fear in your voice." "What time did you go in?" "I didn't go in," I said. "I was about to, but I heard them talking about me. Mrs. Wilson was there, and others." There was a long pause. "You heard them talking about you, and you didn't open the door?" "No. I listened through the door, and then they knew I was there. They told me to come in. I ran." Another pause, longer this time. "You're lucky. Most people open the door. The curiosity is too strong, or they convince themselves it's not real, that they're imagining things. But you ran." "What would have happened if I'd opened the door?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Marcus sighed, and I could hear the weight of years in that sound. "The teachers in that lounge, they're not ghosts, exactly. They're more like echoes, impressions left behind by people who gave too much of themselves to this place. They died here, or they disappeared here, or they just never really left. And after midnight, that room becomes theirs. It's where they gather, where they wait." "Wait for what?" "For new members. The lounge is always looking to fill vacancies. Every few years it claims another teacher, someone who works late, who's dedicated, who can't quite bring themselves to leave when they should. They hear the voices, they open the door, and..." He trailed off. "And what?" "And they join the meeting. Permanently. Oh, they show up to teach the next day. They go through the motions, but something's different. They're not quite there anymore. They stay late every night. They never take sick days. They never complain. And if you look closely, you can see it in their eyes. They're somewhere else. Part of them is always in that lounge, sitting at that table, drinking coffee that never gets cold, having conversations that never end." I thought about Mr. Hendricks, the science teacher I'd been asked to substitute for back when I'd first started. The one whose classroom had felt wrong. The one whose name seemed to trigger strange reactions from other staff. "Hendricks," I said. "He's one of them, isn't he?" "Was," Marcus corrected. "Mr. Hendricks opened the door 3 years ago. He taught for 2 more years after that, but he wasn't really himself. Then one night, he just didn't leave. We found his car in the parking lot the next morning, keys still in the ignition, but he was gone. Sometimes, if you walk past the staff lounge at night, you can hear his voice in there with the others." I felt sick. Why didn't anyone stop him? Why didn't anyone help him? Because by the time anyone notices, it's too late. The lounge doesn't take you all at once. It's gradual. You start staying a little later each night. You start feeling more comfortable in the building than at home. You start hearing the voices and thinking maybe, just maybe, you should join the conversation. And then one night, you don't leave at all. We sat in silence for a moment. In the diner window, I could see the sun starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Normal. Beautiful. The world outside Westfield was still normal. What do I do? I asked finally. You don't go near that lounge after hours, ever. You don't listen at the door. You don't respond if you hear your name. And most importantly, you don't work late anymore. Whatever needs to be done, you do it during the day or you take it home. You don't give them another opportunity. Will they try again? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Yes, they know about you now. They've marked you as a potential member. They'll call to you. You'll hear voices in empty hallways, feel compelled to check the lounge just to see. The pull will be strong, especially when you're tired or stressed. But you have to resist, because if you open that door after midnight, even once, that's it. You're theirs. I went to school that day, but I was jumpy, paranoid. Every time I walked past the staff lounge, I felt it, a pull, like a magnet, urging me to just peek inside, just check if my mug was still there. The door looked so normal in the daylight, just a regular door to a regular room. But I remembered what I'd heard. The voices discussing me like I was already one of them, the footsteps following me through the hallways, the figures watching from the doorway. I made it through the day, left at 3:30 sharp, and didn't look back. That night, lying in bed, I heard it. Faint, like it was coming from very far away, but unmistakable. The sound of conversation, laughter, the clink of coffee mugs, and underneath it all, my name, spoken in Mrs. Wilson's matter-of-fact tone. Daniel Ashford. He'll join us soon. They always do. I pulled the pillow over my head and tried to sleep, but the voices continued, just barely audible, like they were coming from the walls themselves. The next few weeks were torture. The pull toward the staff lounge became stronger. I'd find myself walking past it multiple times a day, even when it wasn't on my route. I'd have dreams about opening the door, about sitting at the table with the others, coffee in hand, discussing lesson plans for classes I'd never teach. I started leaving earlier and earlier, sometimes right when the final bell rang. I stopped grading papers at my desk, instead taking everything home. I avoided the second floor whenever possible, but it wasn't enough. The lounge wanted me, and it was patient. One night, 3 weeks after I'd heard the voices, I woke up at 2 a.m. and realized I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the school parking lot, in my pajamas, barefoot in the cold. My car keys were in my hand. I had no memory of getting there. The school loomed in front of me, dark, except for one window on the second floor. The staff lounge. Light glowed from within, warm and inviting. I could hear them calling to me, even from across the parking lot. Not words, exactly, but a pull, a certainty that I needed to be in there, that I belonged in there with my colleagues, discussing the important work of education. I took a step forward, then another. My feet were freezing on the asphalt, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was that light, that warm room where people understood what it meant to dedicate your life to teaching, where I wouldn't be alone anymore, where I'd finally belong. I was at the door now, my hand on the handle, when I heard a different voice. Real, present, loud. Daniel! Marcus grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. He was in his maintenance uniform, out of breath, like he'd been running. What are you doing? He demanded. I blinked, suddenly aware of where I was. I don't know. I woke up and I was here. Marcus looked past me at the school, his expression grim. It's getting stronger. The lounge is pulling harder because you resisted. It wants you more now. What do? I can't quit. I need this job. You don't have to quit, but you need to break the connection. Come with me. Marcus led me to his truck and drove us to his apartment a few miles away. Inside, he pulled out an old wooden box from under his bed. It was filled with papers, documents, photographs, letters. Every teacher who's been taken by the lounge, I've kept a record, he said, spreading them out on his kitchen table. 37 people over the last 50 years. Some of them quit before I could claim them completely. Others weren't so lucky. I looked at the faces in the photographs. Young teachers, old teachers, men and women from different eras. All of them had one thing in common. In their photos, even the ones taken during happy moments, their eyes looked distant, already halfway gone. There's a pattern, Marcus continued. The lounge chooses teachers who are isolated, who don't have strong connections outside the school, who've made teaching their entire identity. It feeds on that dedication, that loneliness. If you want to break free, you need to reconnect with your life outside Westfield. Over the next few months, I took his advice. I called my sister more often. I started going to a gym in town, making small talk with other members. I joined a book club that met on Thursday nights, forcing myself to commit to something that had nothing to do with teaching. It was hard. Part of me still felt the pull, still heard the voices late at night. But slowly, gradually, the connection weakened. I still work at Westfield Academy. I still follow the rules, but I never stay past 6 p.m. anymore. I never work weekends at the school, and I never ever go near the staff lounge after dark. Sometimes, when I'm leaving for the day, I see other teachers still at their desks, working late, grading papers, planning lessons, dedicated, passionate, exactly the kind of teachers the lounge is looking for. I want to warn them. I want to tell them about the voices, about the danger. But I know they wouldn't believe me, just like I didn't believe Marcus. They'll learn. Some will be lucky, like me. They'll resist, they'll run, they'll break the connection before it's too late. Others won't be so fortunate. Last week, I saw a new teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, fresh out of college, eager and enthusiastic, leaving the building at 11 p.m. She waved at me as I was getting into my car from an evening parent-teacher conference. "Burning the midnight oil?" I called out. She laughed. "You know how it is. So much to do, so little time." "Maybe do it at home," I suggested. "The school can feel weird late at night." She gave me a strange look. "Actually, I was just going to grab my water bottle from the staff lounge. Want to walk with me?" My blood ran cold. "What time is it?" She checked her phone. 11:47. "Why?" "Don't," I said urgently. "Don't go to the lounge, especially not after midnight. Just leave the water bottle. You can get it tomorrow." She laughed, clearly thinking I was joking. "It's just a water bottle, Mr. Ashford. I'll be fine." I watched her walk back into the building, and I knew with terrible certainty that she wouldn't just grab her bottle and leave. She'd hear the voices, she'd be curious, and she'd open that door. I should have followed her. I should have dragged her out of the building, but I was too afraid that if I went back in, if I got too close to that lounge after dark, the pull would be too strong, that this time I wouldn't be able to resist. So I got in my car and I drove away. Ms. Rodriguez showed up to teach the next day. She seemed fine, normal, but there was something in her eyes, a distance, a distraction. And that afternoon, I saw her desk. She'd stayed late again, working on lesson plans. She'll stay late tonight too, and tomorrow night, and the night after that, and one night, probably soon. She won't leave at all. That's how Westfield Academy keeps its staff. not through good salaries or benefits or job satisfaction, but through a room that calls to the lonely, the dedicated, the passionate, a room that offers belonging and purpose and eternal employment. All you have to do is open the door, but once you do, you never really leave. The staff lounge always has room for one more. Rule 2. Don't stay in the library after the lights dim 3 times. The first time the lights dimmed, I thought it was just an electrical issue. Westfield Academy was old after all, and the wiring was probably older than me. The second time, I looked up from my research, mildly annoyed, but not concerned. But the third time I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The books on the shelves around me had rearranged themselves. Titles I'd been looking at moments before were gone, replaced by books I'd never seen. And every single one of them had my name on the spine. The Life of Daniel Ashford. Daniel Ashford's Mistakes. How Daniel Ashford Dies. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, and looked toward the exit. The door I'd entered through was gone. In its place was just another wall of books, stretching endlessly into the shadows. It was a Thursday afternoon in early December, nearly 4 months since the incident with the frozen classroom. I'd become obsessive about the rules after that, carrying a small notebook where I wrote down every warning, every strange occurrence, every piece of advice from Marcus or the other teachers who'd survived long enough to learn Westfield's secrets. But the library had always felt safe to me. It was quiet, orderly, full of books and knowledge, the things that had drawn me to teaching in the first place. The school librarian, Mrs. Chen, was a kind woman in her 60s, who always had a warm smile and a cup of tea ready for teachers who needed a quiet space to work. I'd come to the library after my last class to research lesson plans for the following week. I wanted to do a unit on local history, and Mrs. Chen had mentioned that the library had an extensive archive of documents about the area, including materials about the old sanatorium that had occupied this site before the school was built. Just be aware, she'd said as she pulled out several boxes of old files for me. The library can be a bit strange after hours. If anything feels off, don't hesitate to leave and come back during regular hours. I'd nodded, thinking it was just another vague Westfield warning. I should have asked for specifics. Mrs. Chen had left at 4:30, her usual time, leaving me alone in the library with my research. The winter sun set early, and by 5 p.m. the large windows showed only darkness. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting everything in a sterile fluorescent glow. I was deep into a file about the sanatorium, reading about experimental cold treatments and isolation therapy, when the lights dimmed for the first time. It was brief, maybe 2 seconds. The fluorescents flickered and faded to about half their brightness before coming back to full strength. I glanced up, looked around the empty library, and shrugged. Old building, old wiring. I'd seen it happen a dozen times in various rooms. I went back to my reading, making notes about potential lesson angles. The sanatorium had been controversial in its time, using unconventional treatment methods that fell out of favor decades ago. Many patients never recovered. Some had simply disappeared from the records. The second dimming came about 10 minutes later. This time it lasted longer, maybe 5 seconds, and the lights dropped to an even lower level before recovering. I looked up with mild irritation, wondering if I should call maintenance. That's when I noticed the book cart. Mrs. Chen had been reshelving books earlier, and she'd left a cart half full of returns near the circulation desk. I could see it clearly from where I sat at one of the research tables. The books were still there, but they were arranged differently than I remembered. They'd been in a messy stack before. Now they were lined up perfectly, spines all facing the same direction. I stared at the cart for a long moment, trying to remember if Mrs. Chen had straightened them before she left. She must have. That was the only explanation. I returned to my research, but I was distracted now, hyper-aware of every sound in the quiet library. The heater clicking on, the old building settling, the faint buzz of the lights overhead. When the third dimming came, I was looking right at the bookshelves in front of me. The lights dropped to almost nothing, leaving the library in a dim twilight. And in that moment of near darkness, I saw the books move. Not fall, not slide, move. With purpose and deliberation, books pulled themselves off the shelves, floated through the air, and repositioned themselves on different shelves. It happened silently, smoothly, like watching a time-lapse video of someone reorganizing an entire library in seconds. When the lights came back to full strength, the transformation was complete. The shelf in front of me, which moments ago had held books on American history, now contained nothing but books with my name on them. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping loudly in the silence. My hands were shaking as I reached out and pulled one of the books from the shelf. The Life of Daniel Ashford was embossed on the spine in gold lettering. The cover was leather-bound, expensive-looking, the kind of book you'd see in a special collection. I opened it with trembling fingers. The first page had a single line of text. Born October 15th, 1994, St. Mary's Hospital, Portland, Maine. My birth date, my birthplace. I flipped through the pages. They were filled with text, dense paragraphs describing my life in intimate detail. My childhood, my parents' divorce, my struggles in high school, my decision to become a teacher. Every moment, every decision, every private thought I'd ever had was written down in precise, impersonal prose. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back on the shelf. My heart was racing now, panic rising in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But when I looked around, I saw that every shelf in the visible area was the same. Hundreds of books, maybe thousands, all with variations of my name on the spine. Daniel Ashford's regrets. The secret fears of Daniel Ashford. Daniel Ashford's last day. What Daniel Ashford could have been. The truth about Daniel Ashford. I backed away from the shelves, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to get out. Now. I turned toward the exit, toward where the exit should have been, and felt my stomach drop. The door was gone. The entire wall where the entrance had been was now just another section of bookshelves. More books. More of my name repeated endlessly on leather spines. No, I whispered. No, no, no. I ran toward the wall of books, searching frantically for any sign of the door, any seam or crack that might indicate where it had been. Nothing, just solid shelving bolted to the wall, filled with books that shouldn't exist. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course not. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. There had to be another exit. Libraries had fire exits, emergency doors. I just needed to find one. I started walking, following the main aisle deeper into the library. But with each step, I realized something was very wrong. The library was much larger than it should be. Westfield's library was a single large room, maybe 50 feet by 70 feet. But this stretched on and on, the aisles extending into shadow, the ceiling rising higher than I remembered. I passed row after row of shelves. Some sections looked normal, filled with regular library books, but others were dedicated entirely to books about me, my life, my thoughts, my future. I stopped at one shelf and pulled out a slim volume titled Daniel Ashford, age 47. It was lighter than the others, and when I opened it, most of the pages were blank. But the first few pages had text. Daniel Ashford will live to be 47 years old. He will die alone, forgotten by his few remaining family members, mourned by no one. His death will remain unexplained, though the truth is far stranger than any official report could capture. He will have spent 23 years teaching at Westfield Academy, never leaving, never escaping, slowly becoming as much a fixture of the building as the walls and floors. In his final moments, he will realize that he died years earlier, on the day he stayed too long in the library and ceased to be fully real. I dropped the book like it had burned me. It hit the floor with a soft thud, and I watched in horror as the pages began to fill themselves in, words appearing line by line, describing my current panic, my racing thoughts, my desperate need to escape. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "This is just another trick, like the voice, like the cold classroom. It's trying to scare me." "Is it working?" a voice asked from behind me. I spun around. Standing at the end of the aisle was a woman I didn't recognize. She was young, maybe in her 30s, wearing an old-fashioned dress that looked like it belonged to the 1950s. Her hair was styled in victory rolls, and her makeup was perfect. She looked like she'd stepped out of a vintage photograph. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm a librarian," she said, smiling pleasantly. "Or I was once. Now I'm more of a custodian. I help maintain the collection." "What collection?" She gestured around us at the endless shelves. "The collection of stories. Every person who enters this library has a story. We simply write them down, preserve them. It's important work." "I didn't ask you to write my story," I said, anger cutting through my fear. "You don't have to ask," she replied. "The moment you stayed after the third dimming, you became part of the collection. This is a library, Mr. Ashford. We collect and preserve information. And you are full of information." I backed away from her, but she didn't follow. She simply stood there, hands folded primly in front of her, that pleasant smile never wavering. "Let me out," I said. "I don't want to be part of your collection." "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way," she said. "The library needs to be complete. Every story needs to be finished. You have so much left to tell us. Years of experiences, thoughts, dreams. We need all of it." "You're insane," I said. "You're not real. None of this is real." "Reality is subjective," she said thoughtfully. "In here, the library defines what's real. And right now, you are very real. Your fear is real. Your story is real. That's all that matters." I turned and ran. I didn't care which direction, didn't try to orient myself. I just ran, past endless rows of shelves, through reading areas with empty chairs, past study carrels and research tables. The library seemed to shift around me, aisles appearing and disappearing, the layout changing with each turn. I could hear footsteps behind me, not running, just walking at a steady pace. The woman in the vintage dress, following me calmly, inevitably. "You can't run from your own story, Mr. Ashford," her voice called out, echoing from all directions. "It follows you wherever you go." I rounded a corner and found myself in a section I didn't recognize. The shelves here were older, dustier. The books looked ancient, their leather bindings cracked and faded. I pulled one out at random. Margaret Sullivan, 1952 to 1952. The book was thin, barely 20 pages. I opened it and saw a young woman's life laid out in brief, tragic detail. She'd been a librarian at the sanatorium's medical library. She'd stayed late one night researching patient files. The lights had dimmed 3 times. She'd never been seen again. I grabbed another book. Robert Chen, 1967 to 1967. A maintenance worker, came to fix the lights in the library, never left. Another. Susan Park, 1989 to 1989. A teacher like me, doing research after hours. There were dozens of them, hundreds, all with the same pattern. A year of birth, followed immediately by the same year of death. All of them caught by the library. Their stories ended before they'd really begun. Do you see now? The woman had appeared at the end of the aisle. You're not the first. The library has been collecting stories for a very long time, since the sanatorium days, when patients would disappear into the medical library and never return. The building remembers, the library remembers, and it's always hungry for new stories. "I won't let you," I said, my voice shaking. "I won't let you trap me here." "You don't have a choice," she said sadly. You stayed after the third dimming. The door is gone. There's no way out now. You belong to the collection. But even as she spoke, I was thinking, the books I'd seen, they all had one thing in common. Their stories were complete. Birth year, death year, all the pages filled in. But the book about my future had been mostly blank. Pages waiting to be written. What if the library could only trap you if it could finish your story? What if you could stay incomplete? I grabbed the book about my future off the shelf where I'd dropped it and opened to the pages that were filling themselves in. The text was still appearing, describing my conversation with the woman, my growing desperation. I tore the pages out. The woman's expression changed, her pleasant smile faltering. "Don't," she said, and for the first time there was urgency in her voice. "Don't do that." I kept tearing, ripping out every page that had text on it, letting them flutter to the floor. The moment they left the book, they dissolved into ash. "You're disrupting the collection," the woman said, and now she was moving toward me, faster than before. "You're damaging the records." I ran again, this time with purpose. If these books were my story, if they were how the library trapped me, then I needed to destroy them all, or at least enough that my story couldn't be completed. I grabbed books off the shelves as I ran, pulling out pages, tearing covers off, throwing them behind me. With each destruction, I felt something change. The library groaned around me, the shelves shuddering, the fluorescent lights flickering. "Stop!" The woman's voice was no longer pleasant. It was sharp, angry. "You'll destroy everything." But I didn't stop. I ran through the aisles, leaving a trail of destroyed books behind me. And as I ran, I started to notice something. The library was shrinking. The endless aisles were getting shorter. The ceiling was lowering. The space was contracting. I rounded a corner and saw it, a door. Not the original entrance, but one of the emergency exits, outlined in glowing red. I sprinted toward it, the woman's screams echoing behind me. I could feel her getting closer, her hands reaching for me, trying to pull me back into the collection. I hit the door at full speed, the crash bar slamming open, and tumbled out into the hallway beyond. The real hallway. The normal hallway of Westfield Academy, with its worn linoleum floors and fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies. I lay on the floor, gasping, my hands full of torn pages that were rapidly turning to ash. Behind me, I could hear the woman screaming, but it was distant now, muffled, like it was coming from very far away. The emergency exit door slowly swung shut. Through the narrowing gap, I caught a glimpse of the library beyond, dark, vast, impossible. Then the door clicked closed, and there was only the plain metal surface of a normal fire exit. I lay there for a long time, waiting for my heart to stop racing, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. Eventually, I managed to stand up. The torn pages had completely disintegrated, leaving no evidence of what had happened. I walked on trembling legs back to the library's main entrance. The door was there, right where it should be, with its small window looking into a normal-sized library. I could see the research table where I'd been sitting, my notes still spread out, the boxes of archival materials Mrs. Chen had given me. Everything looked exactly as it had before the lights dimmed for the third time. I tried the door. It was locked. The automatic lock that engaged when the library closed for the day. Through the window, I could see the clock on the wall. It read 5:47 p.m. Only 17 minutes had passed since I'd entered. The next morning, I found Marcus in the hallway before first period. "I need to know about the library," I said without preamble, "about the lights dimming 3 times. Marcus's expression grew grave. What happened? I told him everything. The rearranging books, the endless shelves, the woman in the vintage dress, the books about people who'd disappeared. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You got out." That's rare. Most people who stay after the third dimming don't come back. Who was she? I asked. The woman? Probably Margaret Sullivan, Marcus said. She was the first one taken, back in 1952. The library uses her as its interface sometimes, its way of communicating with people. She's part of the collection now, part of the building's memory. But why? I demanded. Why does it collect people's stories? Marcus shrugged helplessly. Same reason it does anything. The building remembers the sanatorium, remembers when it was a place of study and experimentation. The library was where they kept records on all the patients, their histories, their treatments, their outcomes. When people started dying, disappearing, those records became stories. And the library learned to hunger for more stories. It wants to be complete, to have every possible narrative contained within its walls. That's insane, I said. That's Westfield, Marcus replied. I avoided the library after that. If I needed books, I ordered them online or went to the public library downtown. I rearranged my lesson plans to avoid any topic that required the school's archives. But sometimes, late at night when I was trying to sleep, I thought about those books with my name on them. The life of Daniel Ashford, Daniel Ashford's mistakes, how Daniel Ashford dies. I thought about the pages I'd torn out, the story I'd left incomplete, and I wondered if somewhere in that impossible library, in those endless stacks, there were still books about me. Books with blank pages, waiting to be filled in, waiting for me to make another mistake, to stay too long, to get caught when the lights dimmed for the third time. The library is patient. It has all the time in the world. And my story isn't finished yet. I just have to make sure it never will be. Because in Westfield Academy, the moment your story is complete, the moment every page is filled in, and every chapter is closed, that's when you stop being a person and become just another book on the shelf, just another story in the collection, forever.